Everyone, welcome to yet another OpenChain webinar. This one's a little bit special. This one's special for a few reasons. One reason is that it's an introduction to something, and it's an introduction to something that we've mentioned several times, which might lead you to think, why is a project with an advanced audience introducing something they've talked about before? And the answer is because this thing is very complex and it matters. And summarizing and re-summarizing to reset a supply chain on the key principles is absolutely vital. Something enormous is happening with the CRA. It impacts all products going to market in the European Union area with software. And we have a lot to do. On one hand, we have a ton of details to cover. On the other hand, we must never lose sight of the forest for the trees. There's no point in just digging into a set of details and forgetting the whole scope of what's going on. Now, we're very, very fortunate to have David on the line, Director of Open Source Supply Chain Security at the Linux Foundation. You'll usually find David over at OpenSSF, where he is helping on all of the portfolio of things that they get up to, but especially has been working on the CRA. Now, David and I met at a conference recently, and he gave me a recap of his latest work. I obviously said, I need it, I want it, I must have it as a webinar. And here we are. This webinar is being recorded. It'll be shared through our community and our supply chain. And for those of you on the line today, please feel free to jump in with questions or comments as we go. Now, before we get started, I have to show the antitrust policy notice. We put this up at the beginning of every meeting for the OpenChain project and all of the Linux Foundation projects. The full antitrust policy can be found on the Linux Foundation website, and if you're from a member company, you can ask any questions of our council and the Grove. Now, before I finally hand over to David so he can tell you the interesting stuff, I just wanted to point out that David has been involved in this field for more than 20 years. His background encompasses everything from working on the defense side in the US through to now dealing with the multinational and multi-geography stakeholder engagement of open source here. In other words, you have on the line one of the most experienced people ever for open source governance, and you're very fortunate to have that. I'm very fortunate to have David here and call him my colleague. That's one reason that for those of you dialing in live, really do feel free to ask questions. And David is an absolutely wonderful person, very friendly and very tolerant. I keep asking David things which obviously I should know, and he's very patiently answered them for the last 10 or 15 years. Okay, with that, I'll hand over to you, David.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind words. I've actually been doing it for much longer than 20 years, but I'm not sure I want to correct that. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. This is an important topic, and I'm hoping that I can at least provide some information and some clarity where I can. So, with that. Some context. First of all, I want to make it very, very clear. This is not intended to provide legal advice. I do talk to lawyers, but I'm not a lawyer. And most importantly, I am not your lawyer. Instead, my goal here is to provide a high-level understanding so that you can understand this important new legislation. The series is really important. It's not widely understood. I'm not going to cover every detail, especially not the government side of what's happening between governments. I'm focusing much more on how this impacts software and hardware developers. Don't panic, but do take steps right now. If you wait till until later, then there will be panic. Now, if nothing else, if you remember nothing else from what I talk about, we have a free course. You can earn a little digital badge. The title of it is Understanding the EU Cyber Resilience Act, LFEL 1001. If you just search for LFEL 1001 and CRA, you'll find it. There's the URL. it provides more detail than I have time to share today. The price is right. This is legislation that's going to impact anyone who develops software. And as a result, if you are in this field of developing hardware and software, you really need to know about this law. And this is the easy button to understanding it. All right, so let me go quick introduction and rules and things. All right, first of all, what is the CRA? The CRA is a European Union regulation. And in the EU, a regulation is a type of law. It entered into force 10 December 2024. 130 recitations, 71 articles, 8 annexes, 52,000 words. It's a lot if you actually sit down and read it. So I completely understand people say, wow, I haven't just read that. It certainly has not been exciting reading. However, it's important because it establishes general requirements for making products with digital elements. That's a key term in this thing, products with digital elements, or PDEs, making them available on the EU market. It covers basically, it's involving cybersecurity, things like risk management, design, development, production, okay? And also vulnerability reporting, incident reporting, vulnerability handling. The penalties for failing to follow the law are potentially severe. It's up to either 15 million euros or 2.5% of your worldwide annual turnover, whichever is larger. If that doesn't get your attention, I don't know what does. Yeah, even very, very large companies look at that bill and say, you know, I think I need to pay attention to that. Quick timeline, heavily simplified. It's officially entered into force in 10 December 2024. That's a term of art in the EU. That means it's officially basically signed. Okay, so this is not a law that might be passed someday, or, you know, I don't like some of it, so I'll go talk to some legislature folks and get it changed before it's signed. That time has passed. It is already a law. All laws can be changed, but I wouldn't expect that you're going to see, just because you want change does not mean it's going to be changed for you. Okay. Governments are working to get in place right now, and by September 2026, actually 11 December, 1 year from today, manufacturers must begin reporting as required in Article 14 of the CRA. By 11 December 2027, the entire regulation fully applies. Now, what is the CRA all about? Basically, the very beginning of it, in the recitals, which are basically the justifications and the background of it, within the document itself, it says, hey, cyber attacks represent a matter of public interest, critical impact, and so their goal, their aim, is to develop secure products with digital elements by making sure that hardware and software placed on the market has fewer vulnerabilities and manufacturers take security seriously. And it aims to to enable users to take cybersecurity into account. Notice in particular, it doesn't require that there be no vulnerabilities at all. Okay, no one, and unless you're doing formal methods, no one really knows how to do that. Even with formal methods, you can question that. But their goal is to greatly reduce it in ways we'll talk about in a moment. The CRA scope is incredibly broad, and that's one of the main reasons why it's important. This is not a guidance document. This is a law. It applies to anything released on the EU market, well, almost anything, and it impacts many, many organizations because cybersecurity of any product with digital elements. Now, does have some exclusions. If it's non-commercial, as the CRA defines it, it's not included. Pure websites, not included. If it's only a service and there's no attached product, it's not included. However, there are services that are included, because if there's a service with a particular product, that service is actually considered part of the product. When does it apply? It applies to PDEs if they're made available on the EU market. Now, there are some additional caveats. It has to have some data connection, either purpose or foreseeable use. Frankly, it's almost everything nowadays. There are some specialties that are excluded, like medical devices and motor vehicles. But that's the whole point. Those are specialty cases. Historically, software has only been regulated in very special cases, like medical devices. The script has flipped. Now it's all being regulated, and in very special cases, the regulations are different. The point is that it doesn't matter if you're in Asia or North America or South America or Europe. Doesn't matter where you are. If you make the PDE available in the EU market, it applies to you. And so this, although technically it's not a global law, it's a global law. The impact on open source software has significantly been reduced from its initial proposal. There were a lot of worries because the earlier drafts of this thing, frankly, were unimplementable and were really disasters. But thankfully, the EU listened to those concerns, made some real substantive changes. And so I think they are going forward with this as they've finally agreed on. So let me put this in context. The CRA is actually part of a broader set of EU product legislation. I'm not going to try to get into that, but just I'll quickly note that there's a system called the New Legislative Framework, which is frankly a little misleading because it's not really that new. But the idea behind this, if you're not familiar with how EU law works, is that the legislation defines at a high level, the essential requirements. At a high level, it's not the detail you might want as a technologist. And then the details are specified in European harmonized standards as a possible technical means to comply. You do not have to meet the standards, but as I'll discuss in a moment, the standards are the easy way to get that done. If you're trying to understand the CRA in detail and trying to read it, I heartily recommend read another document called the Blue Guide first. It's really impossible to understand the CRA without reading the Blue Guide. All right. So what's the CRA do? Well, first thing it does is it divides products with digital elements, that includes software, hardware, products including either, into certain categories. There's important class 1 and class 2, critical, and then default. The vast majority of software is going to be default, okay? But things like browsers and password managers and operating systems are considered important, critical, things like smart cards. There's also high-risk AI systems. They're specially covered. And there's certain other AI things with additional requirements. But basically, you figure out what your top level category of that software that you've got as a whole is, or hardware too, or product with them. And then that's the category that it's in. Now that you know what the category of the software is, with product with digital elements, there's various roles to play, okay? And I'm going to talk about these roles: open source software steward, a developer, a manufacturer. That's a critical one, okay? That's basically someone who is making the software or the hardware or whatever the product digital elements is, and then importers, distributors. All right, let me first talk about open source software, okay? This is the area that really changed a lot between the draft CRA and the final signed one. They created a whole new category called an open source software steward. This is a new defined role. They do this occasionally in the new legislative framework. So creating a new role is not a new concept. It's just this is what they've chosen to do. An open source steward is a legal person who is not a manufacturer. We'll talk more about what a manufacturer is, who systemically provides support on a sustained basis for the development of specific PDEs and ensures the viability of those products. Okay, and here are the 3 things a steward has to do. And we, the Linux Foundation, are expecting that many of our foundations within us will become stewards. It depends on what software they develop, if any, but here are the 3 things a steward has to do. In place and document a cybersecurity policy to foster development of secure PDEs, handle vulnerabilities, foster voluntary reporting of them, and cooperate with market surveillance authorities, those are parts of governments, to mitigate risks and report on actively exploited vulnerabilities and severe incidents. All right, open source software developers. The early CRA drafts didn't strongly consider it. The CRA itself doesn't define open source software developers as a role, but because of the broader text and what it does, it ends up having requirements on it. And the key thing here is that CRA does not apply to contributors to another open source software project. You contribute to somebody else's project, no matter what, the CRA is not applying to you. If anything, it's applying to the project. If the open source software is not a product in course of commercial activity, the CRA generally doesn't apply. Okay, and it defines what things are that don't make it commercial. Financial support that doesn't exceed your costs, contributions, releases, hosting, and so on. Donations without a profit, those are fine. However, if it's a commercial product, as the CRA defines it, it applies even if it's open source software. So if you're doing anything monetizing, charging a price, you're charging for services beyond your costs, you're requiring certain kinds of personal data, you're accepting donations, okay? Doing any of that, you become a manufacturer, even if it's open source software, okay? There are some other little details. For example, if you are a PDE, you're open source software, and you are in the important class, there's a special additional option you have. You can do your own self-assessment for conformity assessment. Talk more about that later. But so there are certain things you can do, but fundamentally, what matters is whether or not you are a commercial product. So here's a quick flow chart. If you are merely providing open source software or merely contributing, not in scope. If you're developing it in the course of commercial activity, if you're not developing in the course of commercial activity in a broad sense, not in scope. If you're directly monetizing the project, yes. Okay. And there's lots of ways you can be considered monetizing. Even if you're giving it free, but you're fundamentally doing it in order to do monetization, it's still monetization. You're still a manufacturer. If you're a legal person providing support for open source software intended for commercial activities, then you become a steward. All right. Now, this new definition and changes when the final CRA came out means that it's not as impactful as the drafts were on the open source software, but it does still change the relationship between manufacturers and open source software. In particular, as I'll discuss in a moment, manufacturers are required to exercise due diligence whenever they bring in third parties. That doesn't mean they can't use open source software. They absolutely can, but they've got to evaluate it and do due diligence, not just download it because it has a nice name. If a component vulnerability has been found in it, the manufacturer has to report it to the maintainer. The overall goal of CRA is to have a light impact on open source software, but it does change the ecosystem simply because of the impacts of this new law. For example, I'm expecting that it's going to be, that users are going to be asking for help, evaluating more details, more deeply. And frankly, manufacturers will avoid using open source software if that open source software doesn't have any evidence that they're trying to develop it securely. So the quick bottom line is, if you're developing open source software, tell people why you think it's secure. Put in some policies, put in some tools if you don't have that already. Okay, make it so that somebody who's looking at it can say, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. If you're not doing that, you should be anyway. Manufacturers releasing open source software components can choose to release it to stewards, or maybe you become a steward, depending on their circumstance. Clarifications. Basically, historically in Europe, it's been a question whether or not software can be a product. That is no longer a question. Software can be a product. Okay? Not all software is product, but software can be a product. Okay. And there's various other details I'm going to skip for lack of time. All right, so let's talk about manufacturers. If you make software or hardware and you're doing it in some ways to monetize it, like you're selling it, okay? Then unsurprisingly, you're going to develop your software, your product, and eventually, hopefully, it'll get to the user. Maybe it's a mobile application, maybe it's a server-side web application you're selling, maybe it's a client-side, maybe it's a desktop app. Doesn't matter. However it is, okay. Obviously, the user still needs to get the product, but now it has to be conformity assessed before you're allowed to give it to the product. The user has to get a link to the EU Declaration of Conformity. They have to get information instructions with certain requirements, and you need to include a CE mark, which is a special mark. And if you put that if you don't put that mark in, you're not allowed to sell it or do anything that basically involving releasing. If you do put it on and you didn't follow the rules, you are now in serious legal trouble. Okay. And this is a way, basically the EU mark is a way for them to make sure that you know that this is required and you put it in there acknowledging it. One of the things that the CRA adds is vulnerability reporting and severe incident reporting. If a manufacturer has a known actively exploited vulnerability or severe incident, they've got to report it, and users can report to the manufacturer or to designated organizations within governments. There's another new role, market surveillance authorities. Well, new role for software and hardware. They can ask a manufacturer for the EU Declaration of Conformity, and they better get it. And they can demand all the information justifying the conformity, including technical documentation, and that technical documentation better include the risk assessment. In certain cases, you may want to have a third party evaluate things. In that case, that will be done by a notified body. Now, I'm not going to go through all these. We just don't have time. But I'm just going to simply observe that under the CRA, there's a whole bunch of obligations. I'll just note a couple. Number one, the manufacturer has to design, develop, and produce per essential cybersecurity requirements in Annex 1, Part 1. Talk about that in a moment. Assess cybersecurity risks, document and update, and exercise due diligence when integrating third-party components. I don't have time, but this will give you an idea. Now, wait a minute, what's that annex all about? Well, here's Annex 1, Part 1. This is some of the things that's required. PDEs shall be designed, developed, and produced to ensure appropriate level of cybersecurity. On the basis of the cybersecurity risk assessments, PDEs shall have no known exploitable vulnerabilities. A component might have a vulnerability as long as it's not exploitable in that larger context, but you can't have a known exploitable vulnerability and sell it. Similarly, you've got to ensure access control, confidentiality, integrity, availability, limit your attack services, reduce the impact of an incident, and so on. And yes, you'll have to include an SBOM with at least the top level dependencies. You also have to provide information instructions to the user, things like point of contacts. Now, what about the manufacturers and vulnerabilities? Basically, the series is going to require a lot of things that you have to do to reduce the likelihood of vulnerabilities. If they happen anyway, there are certain requirements for handling them. Basically, again, an SBOM, you have to address and remediate vulnerabilities without delay, share and publicly disclose information, and provide those updates free of charge for at least 10 years. Manufacturer has to notify designated government organizations of any actively exploited vulnerability that becomes aware of, and these timelines are a little scary. Less than 24 hours. There's no business day here. It's 24 hours. Okay? And then general information, 72 hours, final report in 14 days. Must also notify for severe incidents, Again, 24 hours for early warning, 72 hours, 1 month. And the manufacturer must inform the impacted users in a timely manner. There's more details here, but those are pretty scary numbers. Which won't be so bad if your vulnerabilities are rare. But anyone may notify the EU, and then they report it on to the manufacturer. The EU is used right now to working to create building blocks for doing vulnerability and incident handling. That includes an EUVD, European Vulnerability Database, and a single reporting platform. Now, manufacturers have to show evidence that they have conformed with this new law, and that's called conformity. Manufacturers have to basically create and maintain their technical documentation. They have to ensure that a conformity assessment's been performed, and before releasing, they have to draw up the EU Declaration of Conformity. Let's talk about that. There's 4 basic ways that you can do conformity. The vast majority, I'm expecting, are going to do what's called Module A, self-assessment. If you're just doing a default, it's not important, it's not critical, then this is absolutely allowed, and you basically check the rules again for yourself. But there are other options. There's an EU module B and C. There's a full quality assurance, and then there's a scheme that basically involves the common criteria. Well, it's a European cybersecurity certification scheme, which right now is common criteria. Critical and closed important class 2, you cannot use internal control. Interesting special case. If it's open source software and it's important, you're allowed to use internal control self-assessment if your technical documentation is public. All right, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to kind of skim real quick. Okay, what about importers? Well, it turns out that importers have to make sure that the manufacturers perform a conformity assessment and make sure there's a CE marking. If you're just a distributor, you just have to make sure that the CE marking is there. And you become a manufacturer, by the way, if you put your own name and trademark on this, or as well as make a substantial modification and put it on the market. All right, let me talk quickly about adapting to this. Quick steps, okay? If you are in a special area like medical, per the Article 2, you follow those rules instead. If you determine you're important, there's an Annex 3 that lists what's important. Then you have additional rules. If you're critical, like your smart card, you have some additional rules if you're high-risk AI. Otherwise, in which case you add those. Everybody has to do the following big bullet points. You have to perform requirements and vulnerability handling, reporting, user docs, technical docs, assess its conformity, drop the EU Declaration of Conformity, and finally, after all that, you get to affix the CE mark, and you're allowed to actually distribute it in the EU. One of the big challenges and concerns is the clarity of the CRA. If you are familiar with US regulations, this is not that, okay? US regulations, for example, tend to be quite specific, and the CRA is very high level and intentionally so. And there's actually documentation about why that is, but this is quite intentional. So the problem, of course, is when you look at these high level requirements, you go, I don't object to those probably, but how do I know when I've done enough? And basically, the usual solution for that risk is, well, the EU is going to have some standards. You do not have to implement those, but if you do implement those standards, then there is a presumption of conformity and you've greatly lowered your legal risks. These standards are being developed by Senelec and Etsy. And the EU has performed an expert group to try to identify and address issues in this. Again, the standards are not, strictly speaking, required. But for a lot of folks, they're probably going to be considered that way because if you just look at the CRA text, it's very high level and it's a little challenging to figure out when you've gone and done enough. It is known it's possible for one organization to be both a steward and a manufacturer. There's some links. Okay. All right. Here's some sources for more information. All right. Conclusions. First up, if you haven't already, you are behind. You need to start preparing now for the CRA. Frankly, you don't have a lot of time. One of the big problems of the CRA is that it applies to a vast amount of software, but because it's an EU law, a lot of folks not based in the EU will be under the misunderstanding that it doesn't apply to them. Now, if you are a US company and you only sell to the US, if you are a company in Asia and you only sell to Asia, it's not an issue. However, most organizations, particularly in the software world, it's a global market. And so as far as you're concerned, this is suddenly a law that applies to you because it is. Once again, if you remember nothing else from what I've talked about, we have a course. It will go into more detail and really help you understand what the CRA is all about. Please go take it. Free is a good price. And we created this because a number of our members had concerns about the CRA. It impacts us, the Linux Foundation. It impacts our members. It's something that this is a big sea change in the IT space. So it's really important for us all to understand this. Review sections that are important to you, improve security of your products and your OSS projects, contribute upstream, work with others. OpenSSF, we've got a global cyber policy working group where we discuss these kinds of things. Love for you to join and continuously learn and improve. I want to point to a couple things. I work a lot with the OpenSSF. We've got some resources that we think will help you. We have a free course, Developing Secure Software. If you're a software developer, please take that course. We have another course, Security for Software Development Managers. You can guess who that's for. And we have an OpenSSF page specifically on the EU Cyber Resilience Act, which can point you to various resources to help you out, because it's not just you. Most of us are in the situation of trying to figure out how the CRA applies to us, what we need to do to make sure that we're compliant in time. So I thank you very much for your attention. And now it is, I didn't even watch the chat. So I am happy to take questions via chat or anything else, and or just verbal. And thank you very much for your time. Okay, so Harold Fisher has a comment. It applies to every product within a value chain and only within the product that faces the final customer. Right. What matters is whether or not it is, I forgot what the term of art here is, but basically, is it a product? Is it being sold? Don't care who the user is. Basically, if you are, it doesn't have to be what's called a final product. That's not a restriction on this. Mention that manufacturers have the option to release open source under the role of a steward, but how fine is the line between releasing open source as a steward versus being considered a manufacturer role when your company releases proprietary product, thus under the manufacturer role? Well, you'll be unsurprised to know that there's a whole lot of questions about this. And in fact, we in the OpenSSF are gathering up basically right now as we speak. We're developing a set of questions. We're actually going to be working with one of the EC members to try to get some clarifications on this. I think there's the CRA makes some very broad statements, and frankly, I think for a lot of folks, it is not as clear as as I wish it was. How's that? As I wish it was. It is clear that it is possible for the same organization to be a steward of one product and a manufacturer of a different one. That one, it's known it's possible. There's actually some statements, and we actually cite sources and such if you went to the course. But as far as a finer line, it's been mooted that it's actually possible to be both a steward and a manufacturer for exactly the same sequence of bits, depending on the role you take with a customer. That is not a viewpoint that's universally shared. I mean, I think the argument makes sense, but that doesn't mean it's true. The correct answer to the question of who decides the answer is the courts in the EU. That is not a very happy answer. You really don't want to have to get to that point where you had to go to had to be hauled into court to make a determination. So we are hoping as much as possible to work with those who have the authority to make declarations. Certainly, I just as an individual, I'm not part of the EU government, so I cannot make any. I have no authority to make a formal declaration of an interpretation. So we need to work with those who do have such authorities to try to make it clear that there's we need this question answered. Here's why, and get clarity on it. So I'm sorry that's not quite as satisfactory as, oh, look, here's the precise answer. But we're going to have a number of those. And I think the correct solution is work with others, try to get these questions to the European Commission, and as much as possible, get those things resolved. Do you have an expectation of when you... the quick answer is no. The longer answer is it's going to be a journey. Frankly, what I'm expecting is we're working up to develop and work with some EC members to get some clarity on some. And I suspect what's going to happen is they will decide to answer some questions and decide not to answer some others. And so I think what we're going to see is over time, more and more clarification. What if I have a mobile app? Does the existence of a mobile app stretch the CRA? It's okay. Now that one actually is actually pretty clear and straightforward. Okay, so I'm going to answer these in reverse order. So mobile app, it doesn't matter. Mobile app, desktop app, that's frankly irrelevant. They don't care about the distribution media. What they care about is it commercial? Okay, is it distributed in the EU? Okay. Does the existence of a mobile app stretch the CRA impact back to the backend and SaaS site? Yes, but not because it's a mobile app. If you have some service that is specific to the product, then it is considered part of the product. Okay. And so it's a stretch back, but not because it's a mobile app, it's because it's associated with the product. Now, there is a break. Just because you have a service, but it's not particular to any product, then that's not considered under the CRA. And I'm sure that we'll have some fun cases where it's not so clear, but that's what the CRA basically says, as I understand. And I've read this a whole bunch of times. All right, what about if the source, okay, now I got to start reading forward here. Okay, can you talk about the impact of distribution and the CRA, i.e. SaaS products out of the scope? Okay, SaaS products are not out of the CRA scope as a category, okay? If you've got a SaaS product, it could be in scope of the CRA. But now we have to ask the question, is it a product? And I should quickly acknowledge my background. I'm a technologist by background. I love to learn all about bits and bytes. But I've had to learn a little bit about the law because the law matters. It's really important. And one thing that is true for both US and EU and UK and many other legal regimes is you really have to suss out the definitions. When you look at the laws, what are they defining? In the case of the CRA, the key term of art is a PDE, okay? Product with digital elements. If it's not a product with digital elements, it's not in scope. If it is, it is, and then you have to look exactly how they define it. If you have a SaaS product that is a product with digital elements, it's in scope. If you've got a pure website and there's no product, then it's out of scope. Now, what about if the source code for that commercial SaaS site is released? Well, source code release doesn't always mean it's open source software, first of all. It could be a source available release. A lot of proprietary software, source code is accessible. Microsoft, for example, is a whole program where if you're willing to sign certain documents and meet certain criteria, they'll release all the source code to you. Okay, so it's not really access to source code that is the trigger here. Is it a product? Is it a commercial release? Right? Is it a product? And the part of the definition of product involves commercial release. Okay, you mentioned that for open source software, the manufacturer can follow internal control if the technical is also open source. Well, publicly available, yeah. Does this also apply to vertical standards? If vertical standards are not existing for the product category. Oh, okay. Non-existing standards. Actually, let me hit on that because actually that's the key issue, especially right now. Senelec, Etsy are in the process of developing standards. There is hope that they will release these standards in time. And by in time, they mean at least before the CRA is officially enforced. And in fact, they're trying to get them all released a year before. Basically, they're trying to get them all released in December 2026. If you're familiar with standardization processes, that is an absurdly short time scale, especially for standards to supporting regulation of an industry that's never been regulated before. Okay. And so this is an extremely aggressive schedule. And if you don't mind, I'm going to insert my personal comments. Senate, Senate and Senelec have some good folks involved, but I think their process of not being fully transparent is frankly making things worse. I'm fully fine with governments making the final call, but I think not developing standards in the open is, in my personal opinion, a mistake. But it is not something I decide. I have no authority to make such decisions. Sen and Sunlight will decide their process, and I will have to go along with the processes that they decide on, even if I wish they were doing something different. If a vertical standard does not exist, that does not matter from the point of view of the CRA. Let me repeat that. It doesn't matter. Okay? The CRA is a law, and you must comply with the law. The goal of the standards is to help ease the implementation, but they are voluntary. They're not required. You don't ever have to implement the standards. You just have to implement what the CRA requires. Now, of course, given the high, somewhat vague nature of the CRA requirements, that's not a great situation to be in. And everyone understands that. But if there's no vertical standard, you're still required to comply with the CRA. And that's frankly the real issue, and it doesn't matter about the rest. Module A only works with prevention of conformity with standards. No. I guess I should double check that, but I don't think so. I guess we can go back and look, but well, okay, presumption of conformity implies a standard, because you can't comply with, you can't have conformity if there's no standard. Okay, but that doesn't mean that the law doesn't apply if there's no standard. The law is the law. Okay. All right, G. German, what is and that I think that is really a fundamental point, and it's confusing. I understand, but every time people talk about standards, the first thing they'll tell you is standards are voluntary, and that phrase has a meaning. You do not have to comply with the standards, but a lot of folks will want to, because otherwise suddenly they have to show conformity with pretty vague requirements, and you're creating a legal risk that you probably don't want to take. But that's the situation. What is the role of SBOMs? Who is provided to provide them to whom? I know then the CRA, the manufacturer, does not have to make the SBOM public. That is correct. In general, the SBOM does not need to make them public, does need to make them available to market surveillance authorities. I guess the exception would be if you're an open source project and you're important class and you're making your technical documentation available. I believe it's actually considered part of the technical documentation. Although really at that point, it'd be silly to try to hide what the SBOMs are, what the components and dependencies are for an open source project. That really makes no sense. Okay. Yeah, so basically the answer is you're going to provide them at least to the market surveillance authorities. There may be a case where you provide them to a NISA, but I don't recall that as a requirement. That may be, and certainly you'll probably provide them to your to anybody doing evaluation. But the primary result is to the market surveillance authority. Now, one challenge is that the CRA requirement is the same as the U.S. requirement when they require U.S. government requirements when they require SBOMs. They only require it one level down. This is somewhat amusing because the original argument for requiring SBOMs was, man, I really, really didn't like log4shell. I couldn't easily determine where the log4j component was. But on average, studies have found that log4j was on average 5 levels down deep, and in many cases it went up to 9 layers of, A depends on B, depends on C, depends on D, depends on E, depends on F. Okay, and so this one layer down is very much a concession to the challenge in many cases that organizations have to creating full transitive SBOMs. So the good news is, good news for manufacturers is they're not requiring the transitive SBOMs. They're only requiring one level down. On the other hand, this means they're not going to be terribly useful. They won't provide enough information to answer the question, do I have a vulnerable component? By design. I would not be surprised if in the long term there's a change that requires transitivity. But right now we're in a world where SBOM release is still not not something everybody does. And so I think we're in this gradual phase where, okay, let's at least do one level and then we can go further levels once we get that more under our belt. That's, I don't have a crystal ball, but I'm guessing that's where it's going. All right. I've run out of questions from the chat. Does anybody else have any questions?
Well, I just wanted to bring up something. Yesterday we had some news in the OpenChain project, and the news was related to the CRA. It was around Synceliac, and
Since I like,
long story short, they had begun to include us in some aspect of the work that was being done there.
yes,
So,
yes, and I've been I just very recently I was out on medical leave, but I just I came back and discovered that I'm being allowed to read at least a number of the Sunlight work, which is fantastic. I'm not allowed to share it. There's a lot of restrictions about it. But
right.
so on the one hand, I do want to very much applaud Sensenelec for working to make adjustments to be more transparent than I think they're officially obligated to be, and I think that's great. Um, but I understand sometimes you don't want full transparency, but I think for developing of standards, I think I disagree with the approach. How's that? I respectfully disagree with those in charge. I think there should be more transparency than there is today. But again, turns out I don't run everything. I don't control it. And so therefore I must conform to whatever the requirements are that are put in place by those with the authority to make those decisions. But that
Well,
it's I think it's perfectly reasonable for me to say I appreciate what you've done so far. I would love for you to go further, and maybe if I and other people say that often enough, there'll be changes over time. But for the moment, let's work with what we have, and let's try to do good things, because the CRA, whether you like it or not, it's a requirement for a lot of folks. It's going to change a lot of things. I'm hoping that they will be positive. And I know that for myself, I'm taking steps to try to make sure to try to increase the likelihood that the CRA will be a force for good, which is, I think, what
absolutely.
everybody involved with this is hoping.
Absolutely. If I could share my screen very briefly.
Oh, sure,
Yeah,
absolutely. Click on stop share here, and
thank
it
you.
is it is go take it away.
Alrighty, I'll keep this short. So yeah, I mean, OpenChain itself is very much for being 100% open. We design our standards under a simple principle. If you want to edit the standards, dial in, which has been a surprise to some people. They've asked, how do I get involved in the standards committee? And it's like, here's the phone number.
Yeah.
But we recently had a positive kind of development regarding the Synceliac work, in that our security standard has now been referenced in some of their work as they pull together the CRA. So there's a presentation, the CRA Standards Unlocked. It's talking about security controls, and we're one of the 4 ISO standards that they've cited. So I'm just going to throw this in the chat just so people know. And that's meaningful because it provides us with a little bit more engagement between what we've been doing over in OpenChain and what's happening on the ground now in Synceliac. Specifically, we're on slide 67 of the deck I put in there. So you'll see that they're referencing standards from various organizations, and over at IEC, they're referencing our security standard as one of the things. And this ties into other work we've seen. For instance, over at OpenSSF, there's the security baseline, which has some great mappings between what coverage stuff has, including around CRA. And you can see our ISO standard mapped and other standards. Anyway, long story short, it's nice to see Linux Foundation stuff folded into the CRA discussion, including in
Yeah.
Celiac. And while we do have different approaches. We I think have a great opportunity to build some bridges and share notes. So, for instance, on our side, we're hoping to go and talk more with our colleagues in France and see what they're up to. And I know that there's some working groups. I just got an email from Simon Phipps over at OSI and his policy there saying that they're working on getting OpenChain more involved in their work on the CRA. So that's nice. Just wanted to throw that out there, let you know it's happening. But I do see we have another question for David,
Oh,
which
uh-oh.
is, yeah, Harold, don't worry, it's a good one. It's, can you speak a bit about substantial modifications for existing products?
Oh, okay. If you have an existing product and you modify it and you re-release it, is that a new product? Um, I think the short answer is thorny question, but and at what point does that occur? But if I recall correctly, and I'd have to go back and look at the CRA, but I believe at some point the answer is yes. That's considered a, that becomes, there's a whole grandfathering process that, which I have read, but it's complicated and I have trouble keeping it all in my head. If that matters to you, frankly, that's one of those cases where I would say um, you need to run to your attorney now, okay? Because that one turns out to be, it's complicated, and this is more. It's not because it doesn't say about talk about it at all. It's much more of a, there's a little more than a little vagueness that is going to, I think, understandably concern some folks. And so for that one, I'm going to say it talks about it. Please go look at the CRA. Go talk to your lawyer. That's and frankly, I think on the long term, the correct solution is if you're continuing to maintain the product, it's going to be under the CRA, and you need to figure out how to comply with this thing. Um, and I will say that I just I work with some other folks. OpenSSF, we actually have someone in Europe who is our front lead on the CRA and on the front lines. Greg KH from the Linux kernel is involved in some of this work. I'm involved. And so we believe this CRA is really important. This is possibly a game changer in terms of suddenly the industry is getting regulated. This could end badly. This could go well. And so we are doing our best to try to help make it go well. And we want the standards to be, not something that can't be, that suddenly tries to create impossibilities for open source software, but works with the market and is a practical thing to do. Something that's clear so people understand what it means. It's not technically impossible or relevant. And we are trying to make it as much as possible so that it's a sensible requirement that people can actually obey. The kind of things that we're continuing to press is we want to maximize transparency. We'd love to see more of these things, more of these standards developed in the open. We want to make sure they're publicly available, not locked behind some paywall, because in general, that just means an open source developer won't use them. We can't, and frankly, a lot of closed source developers can't either. When there's only 5 or 6 standards, that was fine. The world is too complicated. There are too many standards that apply to modern systems. If it's paywall, that's just another way to describe a standard nobody can use. So we need to move past that obsolete approach. So that said, we are trying to be helpful as much as we can. And if you've got concerns or issues, let us know. And we're right now collecting questions. Chat with us. We'll try to collect. We'll see if we can get some answers.
Fantastic. And on that note, we're just hitting the hour. It's a perfect time to wrap up. David, thank you so much for coming in and giving us one of the most fun presentations this month.
Oh, well, thank you. Yep, and thank you so much. I see the little icons and stuff. I appreciate it. I'm certainly happy to answer questions to the extent I know them. I will repeat, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not your lawyer. Um, but if we can find a way to basically collect your questions and work with the folks who actually have authority to get answers, I think that really would be the best for everybody. Nobody wants this thing to be so unclear it can't be applied. Certainly, the folks in the EU who drafted it, their intent is, I think, a noble one. But in the end, intentions are irrelevant for laws. What matters is what actually happens. And so we're trying to make sure that what actually happens is a good thing overall.
Absolutely. A very good point. And we're going to rely on you over at OpenSSF to keep guiding us through. And our current plan is to let you do the work and then we'll take the credit. So,
You know what? Actually, that's as long as good things happen. I have learned that as long as I don't try to insist on getting credit, all sorts of things can happen. So,
well, have a beautiful day, David, and thank you very much to our audience. Take care all.